Welcome to the module on cochlear implant programming and the role of the rehabilitation provider. My name is Dr. Sarah Neumann, and I'm an audiologist at Hearts for Hearing in Oklahoma City. I am honored to share this topic with you tonight, and it's one of my favorites because I think our relationship and our collaboration really truly means the world to these families, and it results in better outcomes for our children with cochlear implants. So before we start, I just wanted to note that as I talk about providers and I say rehab provider, or I use the term provider, I'm talking about all providers that are providing early intervention or intervention to children with hearing loss. So that includes speech language pathologists, teachers of the deaf, early intervention providers, everyone. A little bit about me. I have a degree in deaf education from Northern Illinois University. After that, I taught as a deaf educator for 6 years. I worked in a self-contained total communication program, primarily with children who were identified before newborn hearing screening existed. So I have some interesting background. And then I also worked with children birth to 3 through the early intervention program in the state of Illinois. I was a developmental therapist for hearing. So I've done a little bit of both before I decided to go back to school to get my doctorate in audiology in 2012. I spent my 4th year externship at Hearts for Hearing in Oklahoma City and fell in love, and I've been there ever since. So I currently work as a pediatric audiologist specializing in cochlear implants for children, but I also work as the audiology research manager here as well. And so I have been doing some interesting studies on brain imaging in children and have found some very interesting findings that I think continue to support what we do and how important early intervention and regular audiology appointments are to our children's outcomes. So some quick financial and non-financial disclosures. I do receive a salary as a full-time employee at Hearts for Hearing. I do participate in research, and those are with partially funded grants from the following organizations, which include Cochlear Corporation, Sonova, who owns Advanced Bionics and Phonak, so we do studies with both of those companies, and also Oberkotter. Non-financial, I do co-author a chapter in the recommended course textbook of cochlear implants, Audiologic Management of Considerations for Implantable Devices by Jace Wolf, who is also my director and mentor. And we have also co-authored a book chapter in the Auditory Verbal Therapy for Young Children, and that entire book as well. So moving forward, any opinions expressed here are strictly those of the speaker, so myself. And I'll share some kind of insights, things that happen for us. But again, all that's my own opinion. Our objectives tonight or throughout this module is to be able to describe cochlear implant programming and how we do the dance, so to speak, of how the audiologists can work with that early intervention provider and make sure that we are optimizing that child's outcomes, how we team up together. Knowing what a cochlear implant appointment might look like and how to proceed, where our help is needed, understanding what information can be helpful in that information exchange with the audiologist, and also ways to improve outcomes or troubleshoot potential issues that do come up. And then also we're going to talk about some important metrics for managing progress and to continue to make sure that children are doing well. So, as we know, you guys are so important to how this family and how this child develops listening and spoken language. What's interesting is an audiologist, maybe at first when a child's diagnosed and when a child first gets a cochlear implant, we spend a lot of time with a family. We see them, we'll talk about cochlear implant programming schedules later, but we see them a lot maybe at first, and then we don't see them as often. And so questions are going to come up. It's going to be easier for that child and that family to work with the early intervention provider compared to trying to contact the audiologist. So the more you know about cochlear implants, cochlear implant programming, the technology itself, the better off that child's going to do. Also, I think, as we see them less and less, they're like, who are you when you come to see them? And we only get an hour with them. So we don't get a chance to really get to see that child in their personality come out, especially if they're shy. And so having that therapist in the room with us while we're doing programming or testing results in way more information than we would ever get if we were trying to do it by ourselves. That's one thing when I came to Hearts for Hearing that I thought, wow, we get to do this together. I don't have to do it alone. This is amazing. So that's what I'm hoping that you will see and learn from today, and hopefully apply it to your team that you work with. I think you are uniquely positioned because you see those families regularly. You have this great rapport and relationship with them. You can help them further understand their child's hearing loss, what that means, helping them through the grieving process, answering their questions, connecting them with other families, even more so than I can do as an audiologist. You may help review or explain information from audiology if they feel overwhelmed or can't remember what happened, especially if you were there. That's really helpful. And then helping us work collaboratively to find solutions when a child's not progressing as we would expect, or they're not wearing their technology like we would expect. This is such a positive teaming opportunity that I think hopefully you'll see how much we value the providers in our appointments, and then collaboratively between appointments. So hopefully some of you are old enough to remember the 1992 Olympic basketball team known as the Dream Team. They were that first Olympic team that was allowed to have professionals on their team. And what a dream they were. I remember just being in awe of their skill and their talent. And then, I find that for us at Hearts for Hearing, we have the Dream Team. We have this team of awesome listening and spoken language specialists and speech language pathologists who are just amazing. And so they're the glue that keeps us all together. And as I say, teamwork makes the dream work. So we're gonna talk about how this all looks together, and hopefully empower you to work with a team, build a team, and start getting your foot in the door to help your children do even better with their implants. So we're going to start with some technical aspects. We're going to talk about cochlear implant mapping in general, what it is. We're also going to have a separate module on manufacturer-specific cochlear implant programming, because that can be a little bit overwhelming. I'm hoping that you'll be able to save it and go back and look at it later, especially as you start working with more children, as you start working with specific cochlear implant companies, just to have a reference. We're going to talk a little bit about sound processor settings, both generally and by manufacturer, and then even remote microphone technology, because I think that's an important part. I will take a step back and say that cochlear implant programming can be quite overwhelming, and it can be quite technical. There's a lot of information that I'm going to be sharing with you, and it's okay to feel like, whoa, that's a lot of information, and it may take practice and using the terminology a lot to get yourself familiar. So hopefully don't feel too overwhelmed. It will start to make more sense as you do it more, as you expose yourself more to it. But I think it's really important that we go over all these components, because audiologists use these terms in appointments and parents are overwhelmed. If you're overwhelmed, they're definitely overwhelmed. So the more that you can help them and kind of help them understand the process, the easier it makes for us as well. Because if you think about an audiology appointment, every 3 months or so, as we get the child kind of progressing, that can be overwhelming to remember everything that we did, or what we might have done, or things that we might try if a child's not doing as well. So what is mapping? So the term mapping also can be interchanged with the term programming, and it involves setting parameters to optimize audibility for the cochlear implant recipient. So each manufacturer has a recommended set of parameters that are designed to optimize speech understanding in most recipients, but there are additional things that can be adjusted by the audiologist on a case-by-case basis. And sometimes children do really well with some more basic parameters, but there are some more unique cases. I think you will find, and we find, that cochlear implant programming is part art and part science. There's definitely some science to it, but there's also some let's get creative, let's figure out why this isn't working for this child, let's make some adjustments, see what happens. And it's always, when I make an adjustment, I'm always kind of like, oh, I'm a little scared to make some of these changes. They might be better, I don't know. So sending them out to you guys to work with that child, even sometimes like just having a child listen with one ear so we can really see, okay, do they have access now? Is it better? Did I make it worse? That interaction, that diagnostic therapy can really help me know, am I on the right track? Or gosh, do we need to bring them back in and start over or try something different? So you are gonna see at times some difficult cases. And I will say that cochlear implant programming, even for the audiologist, can be overwhelming. And as a newer clinician, that clinician may be unsure of what to do when a child is not the vanilla, easy to program. Either the child doesn't participate, or we're not getting good information, or even if we think they're participating well and they're not doing well, we got to figure out what's going on. And so I always recommend and encourage audiologists to have a mentor and to have someone they can have look at the map and talk over some cases, especially when they get to the more difficult situations. And so we're going to talk about the process of cochlear implant programming as well, and kind of what we do step by step through most appointments. And again, these are general, as manufacturers are different in what they recommend or how you program. So we're going to talk about that. So the process, when a child comes in, and this can even include the activation, and to take a step back. So activation is very much, and mapping are the same thing, but activation is the first day. So that's the first time we are activating the device or turning it on. So that's kind of why we call it something special, but really the process is similar on an activation appointment and a regular routine cochlear implant programming appointment. Okay, so sometimes we'll do all of these steps in this process I've noted here. Sometimes we only do a few steps. As the child starts doing really well, we may not make many changes at all because their map or their program becomes stable. So when a child comes in, if they're farther into the process, well, we might do some testing in the audiology booth. Sometimes we'll just bring them straight in to do programming. So we will do a headpiece and a surgical site inspection. So I'll always want to look at the surgical site and make sure that the surgery wound has healed, that the stitches are, there's no signs of redness, irritation, swelling. Occasionally they'll have some slight swelling at time of activation. That's usually not a big deal, especially if they're cleared by their otologist, but we'll look for that. I'll also look at their headpiece site, and I'll make sure that there's no redness where the magnet is, to make sure that magnet is not too strong. I always tell the parents, make sure you're keeping an eye out on this, especially if they get their hair cut or they're acting like it's bothering them. Sometimes you can see a mark where the magnet's too tight, and other times you can't. And so this is something that you can also do when that child comes in. You can check the magnet site and make sure it's not too strong. Also, kind of a rule of thumb is if the device is on the child's head and you kind of brush it, it should give. It should not stay on super tight. And if you try to put the magnet on, it shouldn't super hard. It should be fairly loose. I mean, not so loose that it falls off easily, but not so tight that it's causing like a dent or pain or a mark. So the next thing we'll do is something called impedance measurements. And so that's looking at how the device is in the cochlea. Just my description of it for families is it's their fingerprint of their ear. And when we first measure impedance measurements, when they first get the device activated, or if they haven't worn it for a period of time, those impedances are higher. But typically they start to flatten out, and by 3 to 6 months, they're pretty much consistently about the same. Long-term impedance measurements can tell us about the integrity of the device and can tell us if there's some red flags or concerns for the device functioning properly. Sometimes, because it is an electrical device, we look for things like shorts or opens in the electrical current. And oftentimes, if something like that does happen, which is not incredibly common, the device will often flag it and it will shut it off in the software automatically, or we can choose to turn it off if it's something that concerns us. So after we check impedances, we may compare an impedance measurement to a previous measurement to make sure they look similar. And then we move towards measuring what we call T levels. We're going to talk about that in a second. We'll measure after that, and then maybe we take a break because children fatigue. we'll measure a neural response or an ECAP measurement. Then we may, if the child has normal middle ear function, they're, we feel like it's the right time, and again, that's an individual audiologist decision and part of an audiologist protocol to measure something called an ESRT, which we'll talk about, and then we'll set the C or M levels, which stand for comfortable or most comfortable levels, and then we will activate the device in live speech mode, and at that time talk to the child, check for loudness, do lang sounds. That's typically the process. Of course, in an activation, it's a little bit more special when we turn them on in live speech mode. That's the point where we've made all the measurements and we're ready to turn them on and activate the device. But in general, that's the process every time the child comes in. So, as I said, after we measure impedances, the first thing that I try to do, especially if the child's, fresh and seems ready to go, is to measure T levels. T stands for threshold level, and this sets the softest sounds that the child is able to hear, the softest amount of electrical current needed to detect a sound. Often for young children, we set this using visual reinforcement audiometry, so using the light up toys, or we actually have an iPad, an Apple TV and an iPad connected to a screen. So we have a black screen, and when they hear it, we'll turn it to a picture. Or we might have the old school little toys that light up and move. As they start to get older, we start to use a conditioned play audiometry, or a CPA task, where the child either listens and throws a ball in a bucket or does a task, which we will see some videos to show you examples. This is a very important component of cochlear implant programming, especially if you use Cochlear America's cochlear implant brand, because they recommend measuring T levels on everyone to set levels. For MED-EL and Advanced Bionics, they don't necessarily recommend measuring those T levels. It is my opinion that it is a good idea to measure those on all children, but sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes the way they set T levels is they set it as a percentage of the M or the comfort level, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go on. And that may be something that you have questions about in discussion time or even in our live meeting, and we can always answer questions in that regard because that's a little bit murky. It's interesting to know that children sometimes will participate really well in this game, and sometimes they'll fatigue easily. So sometimes doing something else, coming back to it can be helpful for the child. So I'm going to show you a video of a child doing a visual reinforcement audiometry in CI programming. And this little guy, actually, this is his day 2 after his second cochlear implant. So he received his first cochlear implant at 6 months of age, activated at 7 months. And then his second implant was at 10 months of age and activated at 11 months of age. So you're going to see the provider is keeping that child centered, not so engaged that he doesn't look for the sounds. There's a fine line between distracting and entertaining. Also, you should be able to hear an audible beep, but I'm varying how I present it because I want to make sure he's not just randomly turning his head, that I'm not wanting to see false positives and counting those as responses. And sometimes maybe they'll turn and I don't give them a reinforcement because it can prolong that response pattern. A child's like, oh yeah, when I hear it, I look, and then I don't reinforce it, and they're thinking, wait, maybe I don't know the game anymore. So it kind of keeps it from getting them into a rhythm or getting them to just move their head, and you can check and make sure that's truly a response. And also I will note that I switch electrodes, so I'll start with a low pitch and then I'll go to a high, then I'll go to a middle, then I'll go to a middle high and a middle low, and so I switch around, and maybe this time you responded really well to the lows, and so next time I'm going to start with the high pitches. And so it's important to vary it so you can measure as many electrodes as possible along the array. All right, cuteness.
I spent 25 minutes.
Oh, that's cheating. No, that was turning too soon.
Ash this toy. Ready?
There you go. a little bit of time for processing, then he
Right at the
heard
level
it.
He responded, yeah.
But you will
yesterday,
note
so I'm
too
like,
that
not
when
like it is.
when I'm doing it, you hear an audible tone. The audiologist is playing the tone, so it's audible to the provider and to the parent. Sometimes the parent wants to hear it too, but I also let them know that the child is hearing it differently through their ear. So it may be much softer through their ear than the actual indicator tone. Now, if a child has residual hearing, we would not want to have that indicator tone on, because that would mean that child would be hearing it through the computer rather than through their implant. That said, if you're trying to teach a child a condition response, you don't know, or a visual reinforcement action, if you are unsure, but you know the child does have some hearing or they have their hearing aid on, you can start with that. So they're actually like being reinforced. Okay, that is a sound. And then you can take that away and do it just through the implant alone. So the implant, as the child is listening, the microphones on the device are not live. So they are just hearing beeps through the implant alone.
Oh yeah, hey,
Looking for her.
Peekaboo.
So trying to recenter him.
Hi. How's it going?
So even though he's not completely centered, I'm still looking for this response.
Good job, buddy boo. Good job.
So I feel like he heard that one.
He's like so confused. Like, where's the
He's like,
hand
wait.
coming from?
Where is that coming from?
Object permanence is going to make me find it.
Peekaboo. Ready?
She's trying to
He's
get it
eating
fully
yesterday.
centered.
And he's
Back
on
around.
the chair and there's TV behind him. And he got himself all the way turned around. And I was like, what is he looking at? And I realized he's back watching the
Because he
TV.
realized the TV's back
Yeah,
there.
like completely turned himself around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's definitely not so distracted he's not able to turn to that sound. So I do know he's hearing that.
All right, let's go back to this one where you also ignore me and let's see what you give me.
You can see I played it where I heard, no, he heard it, and then I went back to a tone that maybe he didn't respond as well earlier. Maybe he had fatigued on that. If we stay on a sound too long, they start to get bored. And we saw
Maybe in that one.
eyes, so I wasn't sure.
Ting sounds, I don't even know.
I could have chosen not
No,
to,
it's like, are
to
you gonna
reinforce
ignore
that
it
one.
if that toy's out in
I
front?
know,
right?
Take a bad.
So here in our next video, this is a beautiful video of a great speech pathologist that I work with who has been working on a condition response for this child in therapy, and it's emerging. And in audiology, we hadn't even tried it yet, but she had a great idea, like, what if we tried this, which I love. Working with the speech pathologist, as an audiologist, we have built this trust. We've done this dance a lot, so we can have that I wonder if, and try these things. I think it's great as you start working with the audiologist, hey, I've been working on this in therapy. I wonder if we could try it. So many times I have worked on a task, but then I haven't communicated with the audiologist. This was when I was an early intervention provider. I got a child, a great condition response. I was like, hey, Mom, they can do it. You should ask them to try it in audiology. And then it was we didn't try it. And I'm like, oh, but I worked so hard on that. So, it's great to communicate to that audiologist either before the appointment or if you're unable to attend. Hey, we tried this today. This is his favorite toy. Maybe you want to try it. I'm, here to help as much as I can get them ready for this kind of task. Because condition play audiometry, we can get way many more responses than we can from visual reinforcement audiometry. So also I want to point out this child is 2 years, 3 months in this video, and he has a diagnosis of charge syndrome. And so I think I just want to point out, this child is brilliant, as are many of our kids. And I just also want to emphasize that we never kind of say, oh, well, they're developmentally delayed, we shouldn't try this, or we should wait, or whatever. We're going to push the bar higher and higher for all of our children, and he is a great example of that.
I wonder, let's maybe try a condition and then light up the toy, kind of do that
we can do
combined
that.
thing. You want to try it? Okay. Look, hey, we're going to listen with our ear. You know how to do this. Put it in there.
Eyes.
And then wait.
Your wave has evolved, my friend.
Yes, it has. Okay, look over here.
Sign up here.
We'll wait for it.
Go, cheater. That one
There
was
it
hard.
is.
Also, it should be known that I know this is audible to him, so we're teaching this, but I know it's audible to him.
Wait. No. Listen.
Yes.
Oh my god. Yes.
So really excited that we did that. Super cool.
Good job.
It was a good job. Howdy.
I guess you can't.
But also knows
really
this
do
is
it.
his second year.
I know. He just sees us going crazy.
Initial activation, second year.
Okay, listen. No. Listen. Listen. No. Listen. Yep, there it is. Put it in there.
I'll wave.
Hey, put it
I'm
in
getting
there.
rid of the
As an aside, it's just interesting to note, so children with Charge syndrome often do not have an auditory nerve, or it's a small auditory nerve in this child. That is likely the case. Interestingly also is that we thought his right ear was better, so we implanted that first, and we did his second ear about a year later. More so because he had been through so many surgeries that we just didn't want to add another elective surgery. But he made huge progress after his second ear, and in fact, that's his better ear in terms of how the auditory nerve works and how he responds with the devices. So this next videos are just quick videos of children doing conditioned play. These children are now 7.5 years old, and actually, excuse me, they're 8 now, and they're doing beautifully because of the dedication of their provider, of the family, regular attendance. That makes a huge difference. So reinforcing that for the families, hey, you know, we got to get to audiology. We got to make sure we're checking this device and making sure it's programmed regularly and make sure nothing changes. You'll see 2 different children participating. And you'll see the interaction between the child and the therapist, and then the video of the little boy, he just got his second implant as well. And so you'll see a portion of the time we are actually training him with his old ear, his first implant on, and his second ear on as well. And so I'm playing it through the computer, and I'm also playing it through the implant. And so I know that he's got the task because he's pretty young at this point for the second ear. He's about 18 months old when he gets his second ear. And so you can see that he's got the task, and then we take away the stimulus coming from the computer. We keep it on the computer, but we turn his implant off. So he's only hearing through his new ear through the implant. And you can see his response. And again, I knew it was audible because of some other tests that I had done.
Listen, listen. Listen, listen.
Yay! It's a very different beat than what was. Yay! Thank you. One for Mom and Dad and you. Ready?
Not so sure at first, but then he's like, okay, got this. Waiting for him to process what he hears. And then we direct him to turn it off. Notice how the family is all participating. You can't see Dad, but everyone has a block. Everyone's playing the game. This makes it easier if you can't come to the appointment. The parents are now confident. I can do this too. I can play the game with my child and do this task.
Yes, yes, yes. What it is?
So not so sure about his new ear, but he's hearing it.
Oh, high fives for everyone.
Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Where's mine? Where's mine? Oh,
You get to sit this high five.
maybe next time. I'm gonna go down and see.
So you notice you'll hear me play it down, and bring it back up to find that threshold or that softest sound that the child does respond to. And we change tasks here. right, guys. Now, if we're just looking at eyes alone, that's probably not the most reliable because that can be just random. But we do know that after that child kind of looked around like, did I hear that beep? And maybe I made it a little bit louder, he went for it. So we know he heard it. And when a child is playing the game really well and then all of a sudden they're kind of not, the audiologist can go and check when they responded to before. And if they're not responding there, it's likely that they've become bored and disinterested. And that's the time to switch games. And so if you're thinking, oh, that's a lot of games, how do I do that? One of your handouts is this article, Conditioned Play Audiometry. It should all be fun and games. I love to find games and make listing tasks out of a lot of different things. So this is just kind of brushing the surface in terms of ideas for you. And you can do something basic. You can do an action where they pull an object out. There's lots of different options for toys. So after I get as many T levels measured as I can, I give a kid an iPad and let them zone out for a while. And so at that point, I'm measuring an electrically evoked compound action potential, which is a mouthful. So we'll say ECAP for short. Basically what happens is we are playing through the device. Stimulation is presented to an individual electrode. And basically we are looking for a response from the auditory nerve. Recording an ECAP, getting a neural response a threshold can indicate that the cochlear implant is providing stimulation, that the cochlear nerve is responding to the stimulation. It shouldn't be used necessarily to set a child's cochlear implant program, but it's a great way to know what is likely audible to the child. But I have some children whose NRTs are way higher than their set levels. I have some children who have NRTs that are in the middle of their cochlear implant map. So it just really isn't something we should set or hang our hat on to program a device. It's more so to be able to tell the parent, hey, the device is working, we're getting some great responses. Now, that ECAP response, sometimes we don't get the first visit because child's impedances are high. They're maybe scared of this new sound. So to get an ECAP, we end up having to play it louder, and that's too loud. So I'm, as an audiologist, asking the provider and the parents, hey, let's keep an eye on this child. If they start to look like it's too loud or they start to cringe at us, I'll know to skip that electrode or move on to the next one. Also, I run this test regularly because it can, if for some reason we start not seeing this response, again, not very common, but if it starts to go away, it can tell me maybe something's going on with the device that I need to keep a close eye on. Again, it's not like, oh my gosh, we have to worry about a lot right away, but it kind of makes me take pause and maybe bring that child in sooner or keep a close eye on it. And then I will tell you that each company has their own version. So Advanced Phonics has Neural Response Imaging, or NRI. Cochlear Corporation calls it Neural Response Telemetry, or NRT. And MED-EL uses Auditory Response Telemetry, or ART. So I often use the term NRT a lot, but it means the same thing. After that, we want to work on setting the upper stimulation levels. And basically that's setting the loudness of the device and creates a dynamic range between the T levels and the C or M levels. And basically this can be a hard thing to do and a hard thing to get right, so to speak. For an adult, we can set these C or M levels by something called loudness scaling, where I play a sound and they tell me, they rate it on a list of anywhere from no sound to soft, all the way up to medium to loud and loud but comfortable. And you can do that on each individual electrode, but it's very subjective. And even some adults are like, well, I don't like doing that. Another way is to just activate the C levels globally and gradually turn them up. And that's especially what we do at the first cochlear implant activation, is we set the T levels typically, run the NRT to kind of get an idea of where that child might be hearing sound, and then we turn the C levels up gradually to where we see the child, responding but not becoming upset to the sound. And really, we know from working with adults, something we can do is called balancing electrodes, where I'm playing two sounds and having the adult compare which one's louder, 1 or 2 or equal across the array. And what we've learned from our adults is, in general, C and M levels are pretty flat across the board. And so when we activate a child, we can make them pretty flat and gradually increase them in live speech mode, and then make adjustments over time as we get more information about how that child is hearing. I think also it's important to know that for advanced phonics and Med-El, when they recommend not measuring T levels, that as you increase the M or C levels, it is basically setting the T levels at a percentage of the M levels. So if the M level is 140, then the T level is 14. And sometimes that's appropriate, and sometimes that's not going to give the child enough access. And so if a child is not making progress with a device set that way, then I always recommend measuring T levels. But our protocol is to measure T levels on every child. But we also, on Med-El and advanced phonics, don't always set T levels right where they respond. And even for cochlear, we don't as well. We bring it down a little bit lower. So maybe that's a little bit more information than you wanted to know about it, but I think it's important to know that those do play into how well children hear soft sounds. So, as I said, young children can't be like, hey, let me point to this number and this is loud but comfortable. Even adults kind of cringe at that at times. So, again, we raise them globally. We make some adjustments to certain pitches depending on how that child responds. This can be a good place where ling sounds, if a child's able to repeat them, they're old enough to do that, or detecting it, or you do that during therapy between appointments, can tell us, okay, do they have access at that for that sound, that frequency or not. And over time, we adjust loudness based on your feedback, based on the child's feedback, based on the parent's feedback. Most importantly, when we are raising those C or M levels, is to be very cautious about how we increase them and make sure we observe that child for signs of aversiveness to loudness. So that might be them, like maybe if they're playing with a loud toy and they're banging around and all of a sudden they're like super quiet, or they stop playing so hard. They may reach for mom or dad. They may kind of bury their head. They may start looking like they're gonna cry. That's some signs that it's too loud. Also, I can clap really loud, and if a child blinks involuntarily, that tells me that that's probably too loud. So that's a great way to know by banging loud things. If they blink, that might be too loud, because you may have kids that don't react when it's too loud. That's your only way of knowing that it's likely probably too loud on at least some electrodes, if not all of them. One of the things that we can do also is for children that are a little bit older, they can balance C levels. And so in the interest of doing that, basically I'm playing two sounds and they tell me which one sounds louder or if they're equal or close to equal.
The second one. The same. The same. Nah. The second one.
Okay.
Same. Same.
So we had to teach this child. He's 8. He's pretty young to be able to do this task, but we had to practice this a little bit and make it very obvious. Like, okay, this one's way louder, this one's way softer or equal. So we do have to balance that out so the child is familiar. And so this is a handout that you have that basically summarizes everything we talked about. It's a lot of information, but summarizes how you can help the audiologist in those appointments, rules that you might have, and the like. And then to take a step back and talk about the electrically evoked stapedial reflex threshold, or the ESRT. So what that is basically we are putting a probe in one ear opposite to the cochlear implant, and then the cochlear implant. And we are playing sounds through the cochlear implant and looking for a change in impedance through the probe in the opposite ear. That is great to do if a child has normal middle ear function and will let us put the probe in their ear. We don't always get that measurement from that child, either because we can't get it within their tolerance limits, or we're unable to measure the response period. But if we're able to get it, it helps us set the upper stimulation levels. It actually tells us, okay, do not ever set the device higher than this, because we would risk what we call electrical toxicity or too much electrical current going through the device. I might talk a little bit more about that in our live session because it is a little bit more technical and maybe harder to understand. So in a separate module, we'll have the 3 different companies and kind of a specific what their programming looks like, because we are not maybe sometimes we are, but we're kind of not the wizard behind the computer doing all these things. But it's good to know, okay, what is she working on right now? What is she looking at? What kind of decisions is she making? And so we'll go over that. All right, we're going to break here and we'll come back with some more information about during the session and after the session.